Welcome to AINdebrief, where we take a look back at the most important aviation stories of the past week by the AIN editors who covered them. I'm AIN Alerts editor Chad Troutvetter. In this week's episode, AIN's FutureFlight editor Charles Alcock gives an overview of the Florida Regional Air Mobility Initiative announced this week in Orlando. Washington, D.C. based editor Kerry Lynch discusses how the U.S. elections could affect the aviation industry in 2021. Wichita-based editor Jerry Siebenmark talks about Textron Aviation's new landing gear overhaul program for its Cessna Citation CJ series. And editor-in-chief Matt Thurber explains how new 5G frequencies could affect aircraft radar altimeters, as well as Scott IPC's new app that can help pilots with international trip planning and operations. So Charlie, this week Lilium unveiled a new initiative here where I live in Florida. It's an air mobility initiative. It's not urban air mobility, right?
That's right. This is really pretty significant, I think. So just to be clear, Lilium is a German company building one of these new eVTOL aircraft. But unlike some of the others, its business model isn't based around just making short little air taxi hops within a city. It's more of a regional connectivity service, I guess you could say. And what's exciting is they've partnered with a property developing group called Tavistock, and they're going to build an initial vertiport in a place called Lake Nona, which is quite an expensive new development in the Orlando area, where there are going to be 20,000, 30,000 new homes built in the coming years. And this will be the first in what Lilium says is a network of vertiports right across the most populous bits of the state of Florida. So, for example, they'll be offering services connecting Orlando with Tampa and conceivably West Palm Beach and Jacksonville and down in Venice where you live as well. And this is a 5-seater aircraft, and it's going to be, not just an on-demand taxi service to take you a few miles across town, but more of a regional connection. And I think it's pretty significant, especially in a place like Florida, which, dare I say it, still really doesn't have much in the way of public transportation infrastructure, very heavily dependent on the automobile. And this could break that pattern. So I think it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, and the I-4 corridor is pretty... the infrastructure is not quite keeping up with what the traffic is, to say the least. That's
what I've experienced on my visits, and I hear that. I mean, it seems like that whole area has gotten more and more like Los Angeles over the years, and this could be quite transformative. I mean, in the first instance, it's just one vertiport, but it does look quite sophisticated. The interesting thing about it is it's being built in this district called Lake Nona, which is right on the edge of the Orlando International Airport. And the company is saying that conceivably passengers going to and from the airport could connect with this service.
Yeah, ostensibly, they would use the local regional airports, like here in Venice or up in Tampa, to connect with the vertiport, right?
Yeah, they haven't said exactly where they might put the other vertiports. I suspect, based on everything they're saying, that they may try and put them actually closer to actual residential communities than necessarily out at the airports. If I had my bet, I would say that Tampa might well be the next place that they put one. But, they might well put it somewhere like next to the football stadium or something like that. It won't necessarily have to be at an airport.
Yeah, well, here in Venice, it's kind of in the neighborhood with the airport. So
right. Well, that would be handy, definitely.
Yeah. So the radius is 185 miles, right?
Yes, that's right. This aircraft is going to enter service. They're saying it will be certified by the end of 2024, and that this particular operation will begin in 2025. On one electrical charge, it can go 185 miles. Eventually, in subsequent models of the aircraft, that may expand as the battery technology gets better. But, 185 miles is probably about as far as you're going to want to go in a relatively small aircraft with 4 other people.
Right. So is this a unique undertaking they're doing?
It's not completely unique. It's different in the sense that it's regional connectivity rather than urban air mobility. But let's remember that also in the United States, Uber Elevate still has this plan to start true urban air taxi services, probably in Dallas and Los Angeles. They insist by 2023. I think that I'm a little skeptical about whether they'll pull that off. And then just today, I did a story out of South Korea where the Chinese eVTOL aircraft builder EHang has been demonstrating one of its new models, and the city of Seoul, which is the capital of South Korea, has committed to setting up some sort of urban air mobility service sometime between 2023 and 2026. And that possibly may extend to other South Korean cities as well. And then just last week, it was announced in Spain that two cities, Barcelona and Santiago de Compostela, are going to have trial air mobility operations probably in 2022. And this comes just a month or two after Paris said that by 2024 it wants to get some sort of trial operation up and running. So this is good news for people who follow this sector, because what it means is cities and communities and regions are beginning to buy into this. And I think the more that do that, the more it creates this sense of, fear of missing out. So other cities are going to want that too.
Yeah, well, I mean, the cities really are the key to this, because they have to do all the approvals, and you have to, all the permits, the approvals for operations and things like that. So the cities really have to buy into this.
They totally do, because they'll be the ones controlling access to the ground infrastructure. And also, it's very important that the cities have a plan for making this type of transportation integrate with other forms of transportation, especially in places like Paris that have pretty sophisticated public transportation. Because, one of the key differentiators of this type of air transport service is that it's not going to be some sort of exclusive thing that happens in hidden away FBOs. This is going to be part of how ordinary people get around their communities and their metropolitan areas.
It'll be interesting to see how it ultimately comes out, because, as you go along, you learn things and then you adjust it from there.
Definitely. And this whole sector is very much in a state of flux. People keep asking me, well, is this just going to fall apart now that COVID has ripped the world apart? No, absolutely not. But it's certainly morphing and changing, and the emphasis is changing all the time.
Besides Lilium and EHang, who are the most, if we had to pick a half dozen companies that are developing eVTOLs, who's going to make it?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And the truth is, we don't know for sure. But I would say in the United States, particularly around the momentum that Uber is building, I would single out companies like Joby Aviation in California, Jaunt Air Mobility, I think would be up there too among the favorites. Then in Europe, also in Germany, you've got Volocopter, which is doing more the sort of short hop type business model, I suppose. In the UK, where I am, there's a company called Vertical Aerospace that seems to have its plans quite far advanced. But those are just a few. And I think you're right to say that really it will probably just be a handful that really make it to market. I would also say I would very much not rule out the established aerospace players. I fully expect Bell to get into this sector with their new Nexus eVTOL aircraft. Just recently, Embraer started going public with its plans for an aircraft that they're calling Eve. And I wouldn't even rule out Airbus too. They still seem to have quite a lot of skin in that game.
And Boeing's kind of scaled back in his sector, though, right?
They have to some extent. I mean, they're facing some very, very serious challenges, and they've said that they're going to close their Boeing Next technology accelerator division. I think they're doing that out of sheer necessity. But it's interesting that companies like Embraer and Airbus, even though they're facing the same sort of difficulties, they've decided, no, we have to think long term here. We have to, no matter how bad things are now, we've got to project forward 10 years and say, where do our priorities lie then? And I think it's very interesting that they're sticking with this future air mobility concept.
Yeah, it'll certainly be really interesting to see how this all plays out.
Very definitely.
All right. Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you.
So, hey, Kerry, I heard we had an election. How's that going to affect the aviation industry?
Well, Chad, there's a lot of uncertainty still with the elections, but the biggest thing that the aviation industry has to be aware of is that change is coming, and there's going to be a lot of new faces on Capitol Hill. And it becomes all the more important for people within the industry to step up their advocacy and reach out and reform these relationships and get to know people, because there will be, especially at the staff level on Capitol Hill, there will be a lot of new people who might be very, very smart but know zero about aviation. So having said that, the most obvious change will be the change in administration. Joe Biden is the president-elect at this point, and I know there are challenges, but the certification of that election is set to come on December 8th, right before or by December 8th, right 6 days ahead of when the Electoral College is set to meet. And with that, obviously the shift of power goes from Republican to Democrat. So there might be a little bit more progressive policies, if you will, but Joe Biden is known as a deal maker and a more moderate. So we'll see at a higher level how that plays out. In the House, the Senate, obviously the margins narrowed quite a bit to the point where the Senate's coming down to a runoff to two races in Georgia. And there right now, it looks like the Republicans might have the edge there, that they might be able to hang on with control. But, with politics, anything can be seen. And in the House, that narrowed surprisingly to many, much, much closer to, as of right now, they have just enough votes. The Democrats have just enough votes to maintain the majority, but there might be a few others that come in here. What that means is there's going to be a reshuffling of all the committees on Capitol Hill. There's going to be a much more balanced membership on each committee, probably in both chambers, which will force them to work more together. And for aviation, what they're talking about is, with that tight a shift, controversial issues probably are not going to get through. So things like massive tax bills might become much more difficult. Sweeping changes on the environmental front might become more difficult, and you may actually see more environmental changes come through executive order from the White House versus on Capitol Hill. But, even if the Republicans do maintain control of the Senate, Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden do have a history of working together, so you may see some deal making. Some of the big issues will be obviously COVID relief. The airline industry needs another round or another boost, and not just the airline industry and business in general aviation. They're looking for additional relief because even though the flight hours are up, many, many businesses have been harmed through the pandemic. And so everyone thinks that'll be the first order of business when the new administration comes in. There's more doubt that it'll happen beforehand. You may see some more other COVID measures like mandatory masks on airliners, which the Trump administration has been reluctant to do. And then after that, it'll be, the normal course of business. You'll see some, Biden is very progressive environmentally as far as looking at clean energy. He may not go as far as some of the Green New Deal provisions, but, he might be very supportive of anything that's clean energy initiatives, which there's been a huge push in the industry on that. Passenger facility charges, that's another issue that keeps getting brought up. And Biden has expressed support for that in the past. Of course, now you have to get congressional support of that, and there hasn't been. But, I was on a webinar today that NATA hosted, and the Democrat staff member of Dan Lipinski, who was an aviation subcommittee member who lost in his midterm, believed that perhaps there is a more direct route for increased PFCs now.
Actually, it's good that you brought up the Aviation Caucus. How many members do they retain? How many do they lose? And what's their strategy for building that back up again?
Well, how many they retained might be a working number because you might have been on it before and come back. What I do know is the caucus has lost about 41 members, including Lipinski, and the on the House side, in particular, Graves and VC are both returning. Sam Graves from Missouri, who's the ranking Republican on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and Mark VC, who's the Democrat co-chair. They're the co-chairs of the caucus. They're both very energized in bringing on new members, and that actually had grown to be one of the largest membership caucuses membership wise on Capitol Hill. And you don't see a lot of direct, the caucus forced this issue or that issue. Where it becomes very important is education. They train all their different colleagues of what business and general aviation is and why it matters and why it's important and why certain ideas might be harmful or helpful. And so they've had a lot of sway. And I have to think that it has played into even the elections in a way that nobody's even thought about. And that's populism, because when in the past, I don't know how many elections since I've been covering this industry, the House, the idea of using business jets on any level has become a big target. Oh, I'm for the people. And look at these corporate fat cats flying around on their business jets. And what you're seeing right now, you didn't hear any of that talk in this election. And, maybe the pandemic played into it a little bit, but it was highly unusual. And, part of that is you have a much more educated Congress and leadership on what business and general aviation is. And I've got to think that the advocacy of the caucuses have played into it.
So a little further down the chain, I guess, we should expect a new DOT secretary, but the FAA Administrator will be here for, another 3 years, 4 years?
Yeah, that's right. I think it was about a year ago he took office, and he is in for a 5-year term, Steve Dixon. And he's somebody who he had a little bit of a bumpy confirmation related to a lawsuit of his former employer. But beyond that, he's been widely revered. So yes, he's with us. And, most of the positions are staff level positions. So I don't think you're going to see tremendous turnover there. I have read reports that the NASA administrator had discussed leaving, but not at FAA.
And what about DOT? We should expect a new secretary, right?
Yes, we will see a new DOT secretary. Right now, it's Elaine Chao, who is the wife of Mitch McConnell. But she has had a lot of transportation experience in her own right. So even though she was appointed while Mitch McConnell was majority leader, she had already served as deputy secretary, the Department of Transportation, as well as had a leadership role at the Department of Labor. So, when a new president comes in, they get to pick their whole cabinet. Obviously, transportation tends to be the most bipartisan. So, it wouldn't shock me if Biden extended an olive branch to McConnell and offered her to re-up in that, because typically administrations like to have one crossover member in their cabinet, and that's transportation is one of those agencies where it's more bipartisan, where you could do that. But, who knows? Time will tell with that.
All right. Is there anything else that people need to be aware of as far as the election and how it will affect the industry?
Well, just a couple things. Susan Collins, who is in charge of the Transportation Appropriations Subcommittee, and that's a very important committee because they set all the funding for transportation agencies, including FAA. She did win her election. I know she had been targeted as a potential vulnerable senator, and most of the other leadership is returning, though. is returning as well. Pete DeFazio, who's been in Congress for 34 years, it's almost like rubber stamping him in elections, had his tightest election ever. And as I mentioned before, Lipinski, who his father was on the Transportation and Infrastructure and Aviation Subcommittee for years, and he came in and was also on the aviation subcommittee, and he's just a legacy person. But he lost to a progressive candidate, and so it suggests that everybody is vulnerable, and because there's a midterm 2 years away, everybody's going to be fighting for their positions, knowing that the elections didn't quite turn out the way they were anticipated.
Interesting. All right. Thanks, Kerry. Hey, Jerry. Textron Aviation recently came up with a way to repair the Citation CJ3 landing gear. That was, and before this, it was replaced with a new unit, which was quite expensive. And now they're expanding that to the CJ1 series and the M2, and also they're looking to also make it for the CJ2. So tell us what they're doing.
Yeah, that's right, Chad. We're almost 3 decades into the CJ program, and they started out with looking for ways to repair the main landing gear on the CJ3, and it was sort of a team of engineers from from not both, but from the factory, from their aftermarket department, and from their Able Aerospace unit in Mesa, Arizona. And so Mesa did once they came up with sort of the idea, then Able Aerospace went to work actually making doing the machining and the tooling for this repair. After doing the static and cyclic testing up to 5 lifetimes worth, they introduced this repair option for the CJ3 this month. They do plan to, in 2021, do the same thing with the CJ1 with the M2, and then carry that on as well to the CJ2 and CJ2 Plus.
So how much is to save operators?
Textron says that it'll save them between 40 and 45% of the cost of new landing gear. So that's pretty significant. And when I asked why they didn't just build in this repair option when they came out with 525. Originally, I was basically told that there wasn't enough data for the company to come in and have the margins to repair the main landing gear. But they apparently were getting requests from operators to be able to have that option. And so now they have that option, at least on the CJ3.
They talk about anything about the CJ4 and any other citations that don't have this option?
It sounds like it's going to be an aircraft by aircraft sort of deal after they've done the CJ1, 1+, M2, etc. They are building in a repair option into the Sky Courier and Denali, which, as we know, are both in development. So that there will be that option available to those operators.
Yeah, and I think Textron in general has taken a more proactive approach to maintenance and upgrades, right? Yeah,
they have. You've seen a. I mean, they're not unlike their competitors in terms of they've really sort of increased their service locations here over the past couple of years, and not more internationally than domestically, and aftermarket has become a real focus for the company as well.
Okay, thanks, Jerry.
Mm-hmm.
So, Matt, there's a lot of aviation groups are just wrote a letter last week about the new 5G frequency spectrum, and it could cause some issues with legacy radar altimeters, right?
Yeah, there's a problem with the frequencies that are allocated for radar altimeters, which are 4.2 to 4.4 gigahertz. That's an aeronautical band, and the Federal Communications Commission in the U.S. has assigned a frequency close to that, a frequency band from 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz for upcoming flexible 5G applications. It's not the main 5G network that's out there, but it's for flexible applications, which presumably is other types of services that 5G carriers could offer. And the trouble is that it's close enough that it could affect radar altimeters on airplanes and helicopters, which are kind of important devices.
Yeah, and RTCA did some testing and found that it actually could affect, right?
Oh, absolutely, yep. And they found that there's a major risk that the 5G telecommunications systems in that 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz band will cause harmful interference to the radar altimeter systems in all types of aircraft too.
So what's their main concern? Safety?
Absolutely. Just the concern is that if a pilot is relying on the radar altimeter reading when they're close to the ground, and this is the only way you can really see your actual altitude above the ground. If they're relying on that for during landing, for example, that could be a major problem if there's interference.
And when does the FCC expect to roll on this? And what's the appeals process, I guess, from RTCA?
Well, the RTCA Special Committee issued a report on it, but the FCC is still planning to auction licenses in the 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band in December. So we'll have to wait and see what this report actually accomplishes.
So also you did a story this week on the Scott IPC. So tell us what they're doing.
So Scott International Procedures is a company that specializes in training pilots for flying overseas on over ocean routes. And there's a lot more to flying internationally than domestically. So it's pretty important to get proper training. So they specialized in this for quite a long time. But what they've done is developed an iPad app that walks a pilot through all the steps of planning and flying an international trip. And it makes the process, it's not just making it easier, but it's helping the pilot make sure they comply with all the requirements, which are pretty complicated and extensive.
So is the app for iOS devices only, or is it iOS and Android? How much does it cost?
Yeah, it's just for iOS devices, but the cost depends. You have to have an account with Scott IPC, so the cost can vary. The key point that Scott IPC wants to make is that they don't want you to just buy the app and try to figure out how to use it and blast off on a North Atlantic flight. They want to make sure it's part of your integrated training, preferably with them, so that you can really learn how to operate on these routes safely and efficiently.
Seems like a good idea. Are they planning on anything else in the future too?
Well, they're just working on actually developing a lot of training to go with the app. So that's going to include short video training modules that a pilot can say, oh, I need a refresh on data link over the North Atlantic, and you can just pop up that video quickly and in 4 or 5 minutes get a good refresh on that. Kind of like just-in-time training, which makes a lot of sense.
So anything else they're up to?
The other thing that's interesting about the app is that as you're using it for a flight, it will keep track of your aircraft position, and it builds a journey log during the flight, which is required for flying overseas. And it records all the information, all your waypoints, your flight path, etc. during the whole flight. So you've got a really good documentation of what went on, and you don't have to do it on paper either.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Matt.
Thank you, Chad.
Thanks for listening to AINdebrief. Another podcast episode will air next Friday. In the meantime, go to www.ainonline.com for the latest aviation news from AIN.